Today's event is very much for those from the parent care reform perspectives and the education in terms of schools or local authority.
So I want to talk about implementation of the SEND reforms, some recent research on teacher and parent views about SEN support, graduated approach and SEN support. What does that actually mean on the ground? And there has been in the last 5, 6, 7 years a change in the numbers of children at SEN support. So let's have a look at the data on that. What's that? What is the data? And what story might it be telling us? Then I want to say a little bit about the effective deployment of teacher assistants, a massive resource that's designed to help many children with special educational needs. Are we using it effectively? And then really conclusions about what makes an effective school for children with special educational needs. I just want to start by reminding ourselves, what does successful implementation of the reforms look like? How will we know whether or not they've been successful? We certainly didn't expect them to be successful by the 2nd of September 2014. It's a long-term vision, it's a long-term cultural change that's in place. So it will take time, but co-production with children, young people and parents, that goes to the very core of the reforms. Engaging much more with children, young people and parents. An event like today, 3 years ago, there wouldn't have been any parents in this room, I guarantee it. Things have changed, things are changing. We made an announcement on Saturday about capital funding for local authorities to improve their buildings, their places for children with SEN. Within that, there is an expectation that there is consultation and co-production with parents, children and young people. It's becoming part of everyday practice. But we need to keep spelling it out because it's not everyday practice across the board. And it's something that schools need to be working on more, and I'll come back to that as well. We'll know that implementation of the reforms is going well when everyone is meeting their statutory duties. There's a lot of people who have a lot of statutory duties to undertake. That takes training, that takes time. That's a massive workforce. It's a workforce across a local authority, in schools, across health services. I was with a large health group yesterday. There's a lot to learn, social care and voluntary organisations. We all need to understand what the law says. But understanding what the law says and following the law doesn't necessarily guarantee improvement. It doesn't necessarily guarantee increased parental satisfaction. It doesn't necessarily guarantee improved outcomes. But without it, there are all sorts of risks on behalf of children with SEN and disability. So it is really important that we know what the statutory duties are upon us all and that we follow them. And I'll talk about some of those in relation to the school context a bit later. We're also looking for increased satisfaction with access to local services. Local services, we want, part of the reforms was driven by an inquiry in 2009 by Brian Lamb, the Lamb Inquiry, which was about parental confidence in the SEN system. And I think there were enough worrying findings there to lead government to make the changes that are now in place. So we are looking for increased satisfaction with access to local services. And local services is not just support services, speech and language therapy service, EPs, physios and so on. It's about providers, it's about schools, nurseries, colleges, etc. So we want parents to feel better, to feel that they're getting their children's needs identified and met. Obviously, we're looking for accurate and timely identification of children's SEN and disability. So timeliness, important, and accuracy, important. Again, that's an ongoing professional development need in terms of the skills of identifying needs. The world of SEN changes. There's research, there are new findings. we need to keep on top of everything, and we need to make sure there is a workforce development programme in place. But of course, identifying SEN is the first part of the journey. Actually putting into place measures that make a difference, interventions that make a difference, is probably even more important. But we can't get anywhere if we don't identify children's difficulties, children's needs, and their disabilities. We want to see improved attainment. We want to see narrowing of the gap. Actually, putting those two together in the same sentence causes attention, I think, because we have seen improved attainment. 10 years ago, children with statements at the time, 3.5% of them got 5A star to Cs. Last year, it was something like 9.8%, a 300% increase over a 10-year period. That's pretty good. That's pretty good improved attainment. Unfortunately for that group, children with statements getting 5A star to Cs, the gap didn't narrow because the population of those without SEN made just that bit more progress. So it didn't narrow the gap, but nevertheless, I think we should be celebrating the progress that has been for them. But we need to keep our eye on both. Last week, or the week before, there was Attainment 8 data published. It's only the second time it's been published. Progress 8, Attainment 8. There was an improvement of 2.8% in the performance, the attainment of those with SEN. I hope you all saw that. A measure of effective work going on at secondary school level. But we need to keep that push going to improve attainment. We need to make sure there is a strong focus on those at SEN Support. Well, you don't need to know that because you've taken the trouble to come today. You recognise the importance, but we need to make sure that everyone out there recognises the importance of those at SEN Support, and not just those in the school system, but those in health and social care. We're ultimately looking for more young people to go on to post-16 education, training and employment. The NEETs figures, those not in education, employment and training, are dire. There's no other word for it. We need to make sure there are fewer children with SEN and disability who fall into the NEETs population. And again, that's part of the reason for bringing colleges into a statutory framework for identifying and assessing and intervening with children with SEN and disability. And if all those 7 features are in place, we should see improved parental confidence. So that's what successful implementation of the reforms could look like. It's really important to keep on going back to those to make sure that we are putting in place measures for improving in all of those areas. And again, I think we need to remind ourselves of the culture change. I alluded to it with the first point on my slide just then, about co-production, the culture change. That we all have to have regard to Section 19 of the Children and Families Act. We have to have regard to the views, the wishes, the feelings of the child and his or her parent and the young person. It's beholden upon us all to do that, and to ensure that we are helping them participate as fully as possible in decisions. That's decisions about support, that's decisions about intervention, it's decisions about education, health and care plans, it's decisions about placements. We all have a duty to support that. And we need to make sure that we're giving young people and parents the necessary information and support to participate in that process. Yesterday I was with a young man, he must be about 19, who's got a severe palsy. In a wheelchair, very difficult speech issues. He relayed his story about the transition process. It didn't come across very well for the professionals involved, who hadn't really taken account of his feelings, his wishes, and so on, and had clearly underestimated his level of potential engagement. It was a very striking and heartening message to everyone in the room. Another key focus that we all need to bear in mind is that we are trying to focus on preparing for adulthood. And you can't start too young. If you talk to parents of children who are born with a very clear disability, it's a very, very difficult time. But amongst the many, many things they think about, right from the very early days, will they go to school? Will they go to a school? Well, of course they will. But secondly, what's going to happen to them when I'm not around? And that really is a very powerful issue for families. And our agenda is about all of us thinking from a very early age, from the age they enter a school system, what are we doing at this young age, and later on as they get older, at this age, to help prepare for adulthood? And there is a duty on us all to support young people to prepare for adulthood, so that they can think about things like employment, independent living, health, and community participation. And certainly for all 14-year-olds, the Year 9 review for those with education, health, and care plans, there's a statutory duty on it to focus on preparing for adulthood. We can take that further and say that's a should for all planning in the school system at 14, so those on SEN Support. It should be wider than thinking about their educational progress for the next 2 or 3 years. At 14, there's no reason, in fact, it's to be encouraged to think about preparing for adulthood. And increasingly, links between schools and colleges are ever more important and crucial. There is at times, I think, a replication between some of the programs run in schools and some of those run in colleges. And we need to make sure we've got a very clear landscape of study programs that move young people on further in their need to develop and prepare for adulthood. And we must always bear in mind our responsibilities under the Equality Act. I said I would spell out the rules, so here we go. Another one is the Equality Act. Schools, early years providers, everyone really, must not directly or indirectly discriminate, harass, or victimize disabled young children and young people. Must not discriminate for a reason arising in consequence of a young person's disability, such as admission. We do hear stories of parents who go to a school at the age of 4 and the school say, your child's got a disability, we can't help them. Well, that's completely unlawful and unacceptable. We all have a duty to make reasonable adjustments. We all have a duty to make auxiliary aids and services. Schools, there is a duty on schools to think ahead. It's called the anticipatory duty in the Equalities Act. You may never have had a young person in a wheelchair in your school, but one day you will. What are you planning now for that eventuality, rather than finding out in July that you've got someone coming in September in a wheelchair? In terms of your building planning, you need to be thinking about all the adaptations that you could be making as part of an anticipatory duty to make your school fully accessible. And of course, it's not just for children, it's for a teacher who applies who may be in a wheelchair. Parents who have difficulty accessing buildings. That's one example. Making rooms more acoustically acceptable as well. There are lots that we need to be doing. This should be part of our school development plan. And the SENCO, again in the Code of Practice, at a time of great change in the workforce requirements, the government has held on to the fact that a SENCO has to be in every school. They have to be a qualified teacher. There are very few roles in schools these days where you have to be a qualified teacher. And I think it's a message of the importance of SEN that we've retained that at a time of some challenge to that. We need to celebrate that and make the most of it. And the SENCO really has a role. I see it as being a champion of children with special needs. And obviously, most of these are in the Code of Practice. Most of them are directly lifted from the Code of Practice. But the SENCO is responsible for the culture in the school about SEN and ensuring that the leadership team are following the Equality Act, are following the requirements of the Code of Practice, etc. And I think the final point, again, about our current agenda is focusing on outcomes, making sure there is improved attainment for those with SEN and disability and improved progress. Minimal use of exclusions is very important. Again, we're at a time when there's quite a lot of messages about informal. Informal is a euphemism for illegal exclusions. We need to make sure that schools are following the rules. Improved attendance as well. I mean, these are critical things that SENCOs have a duty, I think, certainly a role in promoting and supporting and championing young people with SEN and disability. I said I'd give you some interesting survey results. There was a survey late last year looking at various issues around schools and so on, but there was some questions around SEN and SEN support. It was a study of nearly 1,900 teachers in 1,600 state-funded schools. That's academies as well as maintained schools. So a very large proportion, almost 50-50 primary and secondary. 87%, a very high percentage, felt that they were able to identify children who are making less than expected progress and who may have an SEN or a disability. So at the very least, the overwhelming majority of the teaching population do feel that they are capable of identifying an SEN or a disability. That level of confidence was slightly higher in primary than in secondary. Maybe that's predictable. And then 73% said they felt able to meet the needs of pupils on SEN support. And that comes back to the message I was giving a bit earlier about identification probably being much better than knowing what to do. So 3/4 of teachers, i.e. a quarter, felt unable to meet the needs of children with SEN support. So there is still a role to play, and I think the SENCO has a critical role to play with that, as well as other forms of support. And again, I think you'll hear a lot more about the opportunities that from Maria when she talks about the work of the London Leadership Strategy in helping workforce development. And only half of all teachers felt that there is enough training in place, which is why we've got the London Leadership contract from the government. We've also got contracts with other bodies such as the AET, the Autism Education Trust, various communication trust groups, dyslexia groups and so on. There's a lot around, and we need to make sure that more and more teachers access that. SENCOs will be pleased to know that pretty much every member of staff in primary and in secondary know when to engage you, which is probably why those SENCOs in the room feel overworked, because they're all running to you all the time. But at least that's better than not running to you all the time. And again, coming back to this thing about what makes a difference, 3/4 of teachers felt that when support was put in place, it was based on evidence about what works well. So 1/4 weren't sure that what was being put in place would enable children to make progress. That's a fairly large number. So again, we need to improve the confidence of the workforce as well as their knowledge about interventions and what works. Interestingly, a slightly different omnibus survey carried out at the same time talked to parents and carers, and this is interesting. It's all interesting, of course, but this is parents' views, and apologies if you can't quite see it all. It hasn't come up very well on my thing. But half of parents said that most teachers in their school knew how to support their children. So half didn't know. But only 35%, a third of all parents, felt that the right level of support was being put in place. Now, I don't know whether that meant the type of support or the quantity. And then just over 1/4 said that they felt fully involved. Remember, I spelt out the Section 19 requirement that we want to have parents involved in decisions about their support and intervention for their child. So only a quarter, just over a quarter, felt that they were being involved by the school in decisions about support. And then another interesting table that I took from the research, again, this is from parents. Green is those groups of families who don't have a child with SEN, and whatever colour you call this, is it orange or something, are those with SEN. So more parents without children with SEN are happy about their children's progress at school than those with SEN. Maybe that's inevitable. You're going to be more worried, probably. Are they happy with their child's progress? Well, almost all parents of children without SEN were happy, but only 64%. Nearly half of parents had complained to the school about something to do with their child's education, compared to a quarter of those without SEN. And 20%, 1 in 5 parents, had thought about moving their child to another school. So there is a different experience of families in the school system if you've got a child with SEN. And I think we need to acknowledge that and do what we can to minimize that happening and compensate for it if it does happen. So there are quite a number of issues in those slides around support for parents as well as support for the workforce. And this I'm sure you're all familiar with in terms of what the code says around SEN support and a graduated approach. The code does say high quality teaching, differentiated for individual pupils, is the first step. So a teacher of children is a teacher of SEN. Every teacher's got children with SEN in the classroom. Every teacher should see themselves as a teacher of children with SEN. And any interventions we put in still will never compensate fully for what goes on a day-to-day basis in the classroom. Good quality teaching. So we are expecting schools and others to use a graduated approach to assess, plan, do, review, to have that cycle, to have it worked out, to have record keeping associated with it. And to help schools and other bodies implement a good SEN support system, these are some of the expectations or requirements that local authorities are under. And the first one, local authorities must set out the responsibilities for special educational provision made from schools, early years and post-16. So local authorities must firstly talk to schools and try to reach agreement, but ultimately must publish something about what they expect schools to be providing in their local area. They also should have very clear arrangements for accessing support services. So can schools understand, can parents understand when they can access an EP service, CAMS, etc.? Are we clear about eligibility criteria? And the SENCO and the class teacher needs to focus on evidence-based effective teaching approaches, equipment and so on. But that will only happen when there's a healthy professional development program in place so that school staff have opportunities to learn what the latest thinking is, what the latest research is, etc. Teaching schools have a critical role to play in that, as do local authorities. Local authorities have support systems for SENCOs, and I think pretty much every authority for the last 3 or 4 years has been doing an awful lot with SENCO support networks, SENCO clusters and so on, and there does seem to have been a lot around to support SENCOs in the new way of working. But I think as well we need to get better, and I'm talking about us at government level, as well as you at local authority level, as well as you at school level, as well as you at parent level, at recognizing, acknowledging, publicizing and celebrating good practice. There's an awful lot around. But we tend in the SEN world to focus on the negatives. And there are so many positive messages around. I think some of that data about the confidence and skills of teachers, we don't make enough of that. We should build on that, and obviously there's more to be done, but let's take stock of starting from a good position. So that's what local authorities need to do. Schools need to make sure that they've got a quality SEN information report. I think I'm going to say a bit more about that shortly. The Secretary of State, Justine Greening, a couple of weeks ago, in a speech she was giving about a wider set of issues, did say, we need to be conscious of the right approach for teachers working with children with SEN and disability. Every teacher is a teacher of children with SEN and disabilities. So our Secretary of State is certainly giving that message very powerfully. All maintained schools, academies and free schools must ensure the SENCO is a qualified teacher. And again, I haven't quite spelt it out, but I've implied it. Every SEN rule, law, requirement in the Code of Practice and the Children and Families Act applies just as much to an academy as it does to a maintained school. There is no difference. Parental engagement, making sure that we've got our parents engaged, that we're using parents to devise policies, to help write SEN information reports, co-produce. There aren't that many examples, I think, of school information reports that have been co-produced from beginning to end. Like the local authority has to publish information about what it expects schools to publish, there is also a requirement that schools publish what they are providing for children with SEN. We need to have high aspirations for all and improve outcomes as well. So I said I'd say a little bit about a quality school information report. So these are features that I would say are a good school information report. It's very hard for me these days to find a school that hasn't got a school information report available. They're very rare these days. It was true in the early days of the reforms, but pretty much every school does seem to have a school information report, and I tend to find them relatively quickly. And they do tend to cover all of the 14 required areas which are spelt out in the Code of Practice. They do generally describe the additional support for learning that's available. They do describe what they're planning to do. They're not all up to date, I would say. I'm talking in generalizations here, but they're not all up to date, and there's not much evidence of review and change from the day they had been first published. Many of you have taken a personalized approach and put in the name of the SENCO, the photographs, often the photographs of the support team, and then you go to the school and there have been 4 changes out of 8. It needs to be updated. Parents do value seeing photographs. They do value names of people in published information. So it's important they get the right names and, of course, the right face. Easy to understand, well, that's often horses for courses, but are they easy to understand? And do they convey a welcoming message? You can, as I said in the beginning, you can fulfill all your statutory requirements, but it not be very interesting, exciting, or make a difference. Do they convey a welcoming message? Well, I leave that for you to judge. But this is about celebrating the good work of a school. Do they do that enough? And is there evidence of parents and children contributing to it? And are they asked for ideas about how to improve it? Again, these are rhetorical questions that I think everyone needs to reflect upon. Also, many, I would say the overwhelming majority, are basically text-based. They are words. Sometimes very long words and technical words, but they tend to just be words. What would be helpful would be to have colour in them, to have pictures. Some of them have got videos or DVDs of what's going on in the school. There are ways of making them very attractive, or there are ways of making them meet the basic rules. And I think it's important to reflect on the quality information, on what makes a quality information report, and does mine meet those requirements. We can't go for much longer, I think, so here we are, SEN and funding. And of course, the funding context and the legal and policy contexts are intertwined. They relate to each other, which is why it's really critical to spell out what people can expect you as a local authority to be providing, what you as a local authority expect schools to be providing, and what you as schools are providing. People need to know what they can expect. They need to know where they stand. And that's really very important at a time of pressure on budgets. We have been consulting, as you know, widely on funding reforms to all school systems as well as to the high needs funding system. And we're currently going through phase 2 of the funding consultation on high needs funding. There's been considerable changes from what we published as phase 1. So there was a lot of feedback from you and others about the proposals in phase 1 for high needs funding, and phase 2 has got quite a number of changes. So we are looking for your comments. If you really like them and agree with them, still write in, please. We need to know your views. So you don't need to write in just because you've got a concern about something. Do write in if you agree with something. So at the moment, we're not planning any fundamental changes to the ways that mainstream schools, including academies, are funded for their pupils with SEN and disability. The same process is likely to continue. A formula that has got a few factors in it, and that drives money to schools for children at SEN Support. So mainstream schools will continue to be funded through their mainstream formula, with additional costs of up to £6,000 for any pupil with SEN. And we're proposing to retain the concept of the notional SEN budget, so that element that is driven by a formula. But it's important to note that all of a school's budget is for all of its pupils. It's actually a very small number of pupils in any school that receive high needs funding, and that require more than 6,000K. It's a very small number relatively, and then that's where the local authority might be able to support through the high needs funding system. It's critical to know that a school cannot refuse admission to a child with SEN on the basis of budget issues. Again, that would be unlawful. And the SEN Information Report does need to describe how a school adapts the curriculum and the learning environment for its schools and the additional support that's available. I think I've covered that, so that's a repeat, sorry. I want to turn to local area inspections. Hopefully you're all aware that that in tandem with the 2014 Act, we introduced an inspection framework with Ofsted and the Care Quality Commission, who are responsible for regulating health services. So a joint inspection of a local area about their progress with SEN. And the two main questions they focus on: how effective does the local area identify children who are disabled or have SEN, and how effectively does it meet those needs? Identification and then doing something that makes a difference. I just wanted to reflect on the data on SEN Support for the Eastern region, so the 10 authorities that are on the East. You'll see that over the last 6 years, there's been a significant reduction in the number of children with SEN support. In fact, it's a 23% reduction. That's no different to the national profile. Everywhere in the country has seen a reduction in SEN support. But there's actually been no change to the legal definition of SEN. There's been increased funding going to schools between 2010 and 2016. So just while I have a break to refresh my throat, on your tables, reflect upon that figure. Why is that happening for you? What's your perception of that figure?
Now, I said it's a secondary school where we take children in from something like 12 or 13 feeder schools, and you've got all these children coming through with special needs. And then you start going through files where actually that's a historic need and that's come through from maybe when they're in year 4 and you're looking at them in year 9. So we have in the last couple of years really set out, and in year 9 or now we're taking in year 7, actually looking at who does have a need that is beyond the classroom that can't be met there. So that's why our numbers have gone significantly down. But that's because we've looked and really looked at who has a need at this moment in time.
Okay. So some spring cleaning and careful review of those identified. Okay.
On this table, we've got a mixture of representatives. So we've got some parent representatives, some school representatives, and some local authority representatives who all took a different slant.
What was your collective view?
Well, there's 3 points. The first one was that there was a feeling that SENCOs are better at identifying SEN, maybe partly due to the fact that you now have to be qualified and trained to do so. From a local authority perspective, we feel that perhaps the new classification of SEN support has meant that a lot of schools have reclassified, and perhaps those that were at school action are a group that are no longer identified as SEN support. So some schools may be only classifying those at school action plus as SEN support. But there was a feeling on the table from the parent representatives that not all schools actually really fully understand the new category of SEN support.
And just one observation in terms of the data, that was going down every year well before we introduced the 2014 requirements. So it's not necessarily about the change to SEN support or teachers not necessarily understanding what SEN support is. Equally, I mean, the reclassification, and you said about school action not being counted anymore, the point is, and I think you articulated, it's about those who require something that's additional that's not available normally in the classroom. And I think many schools found that when they looked hard at those on school action, they weren't actually providing them with anything extra.
And our SENCOs were also making the point that there are other disadvantaged groups that might have previously just been labelled SEN, who are now having their needs met in a different way.
Okay, I mean, I think it is a very startling figure. And I think it's startling at both individual school level and at local authority level. And if you do get an inspection, either as a school or as a local area, it's a figure that stands out, and therefore there could be some questions, and you need to be able to answer it in a way that makes sense for your own context. But it is interesting, and as I said, the figures of performance in terms of attainment and progress for those identified, you might think that a smaller population included those with more complex needs who were likely to achieve maybe not so well, but that's not borne out by the data. The smaller group of those with SEN are achieving better. Interesting, and I think we need to, if any of you are researchers, I'd love to have a chat with you and get you to do some research on that. I think it's really fascinating. I just wanted to say a little bit about the continuing work, mainly from the Institute of Education, who have been leading work on the effective deployment of adults working with children with SEN through different projects over a number of years, probably about 7 years of various research activity and publications. But they all point to fairly much the same findings, that typical deployment and use of teacher assistants does not lead to improvements in academic outcomes. And they've looked at over 8,000 pupils with SEN, their progress in English, maths and science, and working with teacher assistants led to negative findings. pupils who were receiving the most support from teacher assistants made the least progress, particularly compared to pupils who received little or no support from teacher assistants. There was mixed evidence about teacher assistant support having a positive impact on softer outcomes. They felt that it did enable children to be more included in classrooms, although there's a further slide that has got some concerns about that. Some evidence that teacher assistant support increases dependency. And remember that focus I had at the beginning about preparing for adulthood and preparing for independence. So we need to get that balance right. But certainly there's strong evidence that teacher assistant help eases teacher workload and the stress for teachers and reduces classroom disruption. So mixed evidence there. And what they also found, looking in detail, they've spent time in the classroom watching the teaching and learning processes that are going on. Megan, could I have some more water? Thank you. They said that teachers spend more time with children explaining concepts. Teacher assistant explanations are often inaccurate or confusing. Teachers tend to, as part of their skills as teachers, they give feedback, whereas teacher assistants tend to provide prompt pupils, they tend to provide the answers. Thank you very much. Teachers linked teaching and learning in the classroom to prior knowledge, prior activities, whereas teacher assistants were more concerned with getting the task done. And teachers in the way they talk to children open up discussions. Teacher assistants tended to use closed questions, which close down in exploration and investigatory discussions. So that's part of what they felt. And I think we need to learn from this about how we use teacher assistants effectively. And interestingly, children with SEN experienced a high level of separation from the classroom, from the curriculum, from teachers, and from peers. They had less whole class teaching. They had far more interaction with a teacher assistant. They had more time and interventions out of the classroom than those without SEN, and they actually had fewer interactions with peers because they were out of the classroom or with another adult all the time. But there are ways I think we need to think about, and I think the analysis that these studies are doing really helps hone in on what we can do to make sure we use teacher assistants very effectively. And there's a list of things I've extracted from the research. So there is a lot of work to be done in terms of making sure we all get the best from teacher assistants. And I think it's really important in terms of the outcomes agenda and preparing for adulthood and independence that we reflect on our practice in relation to the use of teacher assistants. Another feature of data at the moment, for the last few years, there have been an increased number of children going into special schools. The special school population has increased quite a lot over the recent times. I'm sure local authority officers know that very well. And I think we need to keep on reminding ourselves we have got an inclusive agenda. The code of practice is driven by a mainstream presumption. And when we remind ourselves of the evidence of impact, the data is very hard to find about does it matter where pupils are taught. Well, there is a very important study we can go back to, which is a few years ago from Ofsted, who did an investigation into all different types of settings and where was it most effective to educate children with SEN. And they said that really the place was not the factor. The quality of what was being provided was what made a difference to children. They did find that fewer children with profound and multiple learning difficulties or severe learning difficulties were placed in mainstream schools, but where they were just as likely to do as well as those who were being taught in special schools. They found that effective provision was distributed equally in mainstream or special schools. They found slightly more if you had a resource provision in a mainstream school or in a unit in a mainstream school, there was slightly better quality provision across the school as a whole. It wasn't statistically significant, but they did find that PRUs were the least successful getting outcomes for children with SEN. Co-location, so special schools being located on the same site as a mainstream school, did provide good opportunities for children with SEN to mix with peers, but no more so than if you had a resource provision or a unit. And although there was increased aspiration for collaboration between special and mainstream sectors, so people talk about the wanting to do it, but there wasn't that much good practice in play. But I think we need to keep reminding ourselves at a time of great pressure on special school placements, where is the effective place to educate children with SEN? And clearly from that research there, that's not the most important feature. So just pulling it all together, what are the implications of these reforms for schools? Well, the new code applies to every school. Mainstream, academy, free school, etc. We've got to put children and parents at the heart of the system. We need to publish a good school information report. We need to focus on quality first teaching. The role of the SENCO, it is demanding, but it's very important, and I think it's great that it's been reinforced by the government at a time when lots of workforce requirements have been changing. Working with education, health and care plans, that's quite a new challenge. They're very different from statements, and they're very different from one authority to another. So if you're a school that's got children from other authorities with education, health and care plans, I'm sure you're noticing quite a world of difference. It's beginning to, I think, settle down, and there's going to be much more commonality, I think. But again, schools need to focus on outcomes, 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 preparing for adulthood, independence. And finally, what makes an effective school for all children with SEN and disability? Well, they welcome all children, and parents feel at ease with the school. Include all children in all educational and social activities, and avoids exclusion. There is a focus on workforce, all teachers being teachers of children with SEN, and systems in place to support that. Can demonstrate progress for all children in educational and social skills, and helping children become more independent.